without subsidies, it's just not financially sustainable to make a feature film in Canada?
Without any form of subsidy, the pool of talent that is able to somehow find the resources to make films would be so small that by definition the chances for success would be equally small. What would happen is that almost all of the talented people would go elsewhere, anywhere where it is more financially feasible to make a career. So you can read between the lines and see that primarily that for English Canadians is going to be going to the US. It's fine for Canadians to work in the US, but we want them to work a lot in Canada as well. Not only the directors and the writers, but also the stars. So we have people like Sarah Polley who have made their career in Canada. They're also able to make films from other countries, but we want to make sure there's enough activity in Canada to keep all of these terrific, talented people engaged for at least a good part of the year.
It sounds a lot to me like to make a feature film in Canada, you have to go through Telefilm.
There are quite a few feature films made in Canada without Telefilm. However, they tend to be what I would call micro-budget films, or they tend to be feature-length films made for cable television. In terms of a theatrical quality feature film, in order to get the production values to a certain level, yes, the filmmakers do tend to need Telefilm. Their other option would be some kind of studio financing, which means you no longer have a Canadian film, but you have a film from the US.
That actually brings me to one sort of case study we've been looking at in the film, that whole idea that having to go to and look at US money. If you look at a film like Juno, that had a Canadian director, Canadian cast, shot in Canada, predominantly Canadian crew, but it didn't qualify as a Canadian film. Why didn't it qualify as a Canadian film? What went wrong?
There have been examples of films where what I would call the key creative talent are Canadians. So Big Fat Greek Wedding's an example, Juno's another example, and I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking of. Those films don't qualify as Canadian under the regulations. Those regulations are in black and white. It's not a matter of personal discretion of any individual. It's basically in the tax laws of Canada that in order to qualify as Canadian, you need a Canadian producer. You need a certain amount of the expenditures to be in Canada, and you need to adhere to the point system where certain numbers of points are attached to various of the Canadian talent. So the cinematographer, the art director, the leading performer or second lead performer, and so on. So you have to adhere to the rules. The key rule in Canada is the producer, which is really the directing mind of the business aspect of the production. That person has to be Canadian. In the case of a treaty co-production, there's one Canadian producer and one producer from the other country, the treaty country. But if you don't do that, then by definition, it's impossible to have a Canadian film.
And why is that important to Telefilm, to maintain that, like, to have that qualify as Canadianness, the copyright or the ownership?
Well, there's very limited resources at Telefilm, and therefore we draw the line certainly at a certain level of Canadianness. For us, it's a minimum of 8 out of 10 points, the Cavco points. So the other thing is that we are in the talent development business, which means developing a Canadian producer, a Canadian writer, and a Canadian director. Those are really the three kind of directing minds of any production. So that's key for us. And if you want any of those roles to be fulfilled by people who are not Canadian, the way to do it is by an international treaty co-production, which Telefilm does support. We've had many successful examples of treaty co-productions, and we enjoy supporting them.